Hey everybody, today we are debating atheism versus theism, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for this epic debate. You know what? It's hard to say how excited I am for this because this is going to be, we have classic theism versus atheism, and we have two highly skilled debaters, very articulate gentlemen, so this is going to be a lot of fun. If this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button for reminders as we have future debates coming up. And we are trying to build an eclectic community of people from all walks of life, and want to let you know that each of the speakers has their link down in the description box. So, just switching their picture, I just realized, so sorry guys, I have had your pictures in the wrong spot, so I'm switching them over and letting everybody know TJump is the gentleman on the left, and now we have it correct. So, Nomad, thanks for being here. First time. We were thrilled to have you. And he is on the right, everybody. So, as mentioned, they're linked in the description. So, we are going to jump right into this. Gentlemen, I know that technically, Nomad, we'd usually have you go first because you're taking the affirmative, namely that God exists. So, if you feel comfortable going first, we will let you have the floor. And thanks again for being here.
Awesome. Thank you for hosting. Thanks, Tom, for taking the debate. Glad to have the opportunity to do this with you guys. So I'll jump right in. So I'll lay out my position, and I guess Tom can respond. I sort of break down my position into segments, so it's sort of easier to digest. And then from there, if you want to jump in between each segment, it might make it easier to kind of to discuss it. So I'm the Nomad, and a Nomad. A Nomad is an individual that adopts the axis as a basis for establishing their worldview. The axis is a metaphysical framework that operates as a compass, a key or guiding tool for navigating the landscape of philosophical ideas. It's derived through proper understanding of the primary tenets of the nomadic school of thought, which are called the nomadic orders. These are four fundamental principles from which the axis is derived. I want to say the closest position to my view right now is that I found is like Neoplatonism, I guess, which most major religions have some variation of in at least one vein of their traditions. However, today's topic is theism versus atheism. I will be defending theism, which is simply the belief that God and or gods do in fact exist, and proceed to integrate my view with my ideas on naturalism, meta-naturalism, and all while contextualizing that within my view of the nature of evidence and explanation. So I guess the best place to start is to talk about the definition of God. What do I even mean by God? So I want to say that the most concise definition of God under my conception is the simplest ontological state with the broadest explanatory power. All of the classical attributes, on my view, are entailments of this definition and are understood appropriately only when derived from that description. This coincides with the central idea that spiritual practitioners, theologians, it coincides with the perspective that what theism is targeting is a status of metaphysical and causal primacy. And I think that's largely across the board for most major religions, as well as some of the more prominent ones in the West. With this in mind, I guess a non-arbitrary conception of God is essentially only addressing two main questions. One, what is fundamental reality? And two, what is the nature of the relationship between fundamental reality and conditioned or derivative reality? Theology, or the study of God, would just involve investigating what the phenomenological, epistemic, existential implications are that follow universally from answering those two main questions. So I would say, if you're not addressing those questions, you're simply just not talking about God at root. If you presume like the omni characteristics without understanding how they relate to those questions, you likely have misconceived the divine, which will either leave you defending seemingly arbitrary properties or arguing against a superficial concept. So my proposal is that if you properly investigate these questions, you'll find that theism follows quite clearly. So how do we reason to God as such, and what can be attributed? So given my definition, like the simplest ontological state with the broadest explanatory power, it follows that theism is a unification account modeled by a hierarchy of symmetrical or symmetry preserving grounding relations that ultimately bottom out in what is meant by God or the absolute. Reasoning towards God is actually a little bit tricky because the tools with which I will be launching the analysis from also fall within the explanatory scope of the entity itself that I'm attempting to account for, meaning methods of investigation at my disposal will in principle come in terms of, or will inevitably be extended attributes of the divine. This means that part of the reasoning process will require reverse engineering the methods themselves in a manner that accords with the relationship between unification tiers of grounding preconditions. So I guess the first part of my approach is, let's talk about that first question. What is fundamental reality? Specifically, what does it mean for something to be more fundamental than another thing under this model of unification? This leads me to that first principle I talked about, which is the principle of ontological parsimony. The principle states that unity, simplicity, and singularity are ontologically prior to diversity, multiplicity, and complexity. What this means is the more fundamental something is, the simpler in quantitative attributes, more unified in qualitative properties, and singular in compositional manifolds it will be, and the broader it will be in its scope of explanatory potential, explanatory universality or generality. Conversely, the lower the ontological priority of an entity, the higher degrees of multiplicity corresponding to the quantitative attributes, diversity corresponding to the qualitative properties, and obviously complexity corresponding to more parts than not in compositional manifolds that a feature will possess. Again, resulting in an increasingly constrained explanatory potential, or explanatory particularity is what I call it, or uniqueness. Additionally, this indicates that an entity is more ontologically primitive if it can actively and or passively interact with a wider range of phenomena. Since generalization or explanatory universality is the basis for broadening the scope of compatibility between distinct ontological categories. In other words, the higher the ontological priority something has, the more things it can causally interact with or be informed by. This also entails that fundamental reality must be one maximally simple, unified state, where all conditional things come in terms of its finite abstractions into higher degrees of bundled diversity, multiplicity, and complexity, but as a whole, it itself comes in terms of or reduces to nothing else. I guess a third thing that's important to mention about this first point is that it's limitation that gives things increased particularization or explanatory uniqueness. And explanatory uniqueness accounts for the predictive capacity of some state of affairs over another. So I guess we can get into that more a little bit later, but I'll move right along. So again, even though there is no simpler entity than that which is fundamental, simplicity can't be the only defining characteristic, since absolute simplicity would mean it could not have potential to give rise to multiplicity and the diversity that we see in the world. Yet it seems evident from our phenomenological experience that of the world that there is a wide range of distinct things to account for. Thus, latent within its ontology, there must be potency to bring about apparent diversity of qualities and relations we experience along with the phenomenal character that coincide with them. Potency, as understood here, implies a capacity to bring about diversity, multiplicity, and complexity, which is to instantiate boundary conditions and generate degrees of distinction by a process of limitation. At root, potency is the active or halting principle that manifests dissimilarity or actualizes potential in the world. Dissimilarity as such would be form or pattern. Sort of what potential is. It's like form or pattern becoming actualized, and potency is the active force that abstracts the external potential such that it can now be something that other actualized potentials can be amended to or representationally in or out of accord with. This would make it normative, prescriptive force, a prescriptive force that can enact change in the world as a causal effect, but also dispositional in its form, abstract objects, abstract form. So the active force would require a passive counterpart to adopt the dissimilarity and give actuality upon externalization of the pattern, rendering it into qualitative expression. This would constitute the embodiment of a pattern, which would reflect an inverse but proportional relationship to the initiating active force, making it dispositional as a concrete entity, but also normative and causal effect. So what that's basically saying is that in this duality that you sort of impose on, that sort of seems to be a thread throughout all phenomena we experience in the world, there's an active feature that contextualizes pattern and embeds it in the world, and then there's a passive feature that takes that pattern and renders it into qualitative expression. Dissimilarity or potential would be the formal content, and similarity or actuality would be the substantive content for the character of any conditioned phenomenon. And interestingly enough, it would also kind of correspond to an ontological equivalent of digital computing's ones and zeros. So it wouldn't actually be ones and zeros, but it's just interesting that when you start with digital computing and you have ones and zeros, you have higher order languages that come from that, the recontextualization of two principles, the principle of activity and the principle of halting. And that's sort of, I think, and this would predict that there's an ontological counterpart to that. This kind of leads to the second principle, which is the principle of ontological symmetry. Essentially says that a symmetrical duality of active and passive opposites are constitutive of all conditioned phenomena. So for any conditional phenomena, there exists within it a principal duality of active and passive complementary ontologies that establish the phenomenal character of a thing. So for example, when we look around the world, we see distinction, we see uniqueness, but we also see similarity. And the distinctness accounts for the unique predictive capacity of individual objects in the world, but the similarity accounts for the transformational compatibility of things. So you can take a chair and you can break it down into its atoms. You can take those same atoms and break it and build it up into like a house or something like that. So there are two principles that are sort of interplay. So it's sort of like a holomorphism type thing going on. But they both seem to be simultaneous in any given composition. So it's an active and passive within each of those. So moving on to like the third principle or the third part. So fundamental reality can also be construed as that which is metaphysically necessary or most real, meaning there would be no possible world or, let's say, hypothetical state of affairs where it was not actual, since any distinct thing that can possibly become independently actualized would owe its being or derive from the ontology of the fundamental unity, and thus would be contingent. This leads to sort of our second question. What is the nature of the relationship between fundamental reality and conditioned or derivative reality? Specifically, how does a purely actual state of unity, singularity, and simplicity become diversity, multiplicity, and complexity, and vice versa? This brings us to the third principle of the axis, principle of ontological emergence, which basically states all potentiality or actualized potentials are derivative of or reducible to some other actuality. Anything actual is either a compounding potential of a deeper, more primitive actuality, or a reductive potential of a subsequent actuality, or both. Compounding potential describes the identity of an ontological composition as a result of reflection, duplication, and diversification of any unique component attributes of the distinct compositional set. So in other words, just to kind of simplify it if it would help, any single or variety of compositions are the compounding potential of the lowest common set of unique attributes that compose them. This encompasses compositional reflection or externalization, quantitative duplication, individuation, so creating a multiplicity of things, qualitative diversification or refraction, taking quality, refracting it into other qualities, and then derivative of an entity or other compositions. So that's compounding potential, taking fundamental elements, duplicating them, and rebundling them into new unique compositions. So that's sort of the second thing. Consequently, this is constitutive of what it means for something to undergo particularization, which is simply to become more particular and consequently less universal in both its intrinsic features and explanatory scope. The opposing principle, the symmetrical principle to that, would be reductive potential. Reductive potential describes the opposite, describes the identity of any single composition as a consequence of collapse, synthesis, and depletion of any unique component attributes that any of its distinct, any unique component attributes of any distinct compositional set or sets. So here's a quick example that might be helpful. A wall would be the compounding potential of red, blue, and yellow bricks that entirely compose that wall. So that wall is the compounding potential of the fundamental elements that compose it. A red, blue, and yellow bricks would be the reductive potential of the wall. So there's an inverse relationship to that. It's not merely a part-whole relationship, because you can, not all parts entail a reductive potential. So that's sort of the idea there. Alternatively, again, this is constitutive of what it means to undergo universalization, speaking of reductive potential now, which is simply to become more general and consequently less particular in both its intrinsic features and explanatory scope. So what do we have so far with these principles? We have fundamental reality has the greatest scope of compounding potential. We have a fundamental reality that is the reductive potential of all phenomena. We have fundamental reality that's necessary and actual, because the second principle entails that there's no such thing as hard emergence, since existence and non-existence are relative to modes of externalization and internalization. And a rejection of hard emergence is sort of incoherent in the sense that there's no ontic. It's like saying there is no ontic condition that can be real apart from its. Well, it's not like saying that. What it is that there's no, or a way to describe what it is there is no ontic condition that can be real apart from its actuality or potentiality to be. So therefore, whatever can possibly be actual has always been possible via real ontic status of potential. The more particularized things become, the more constrained their causal influence and interactive range also becomes, and that's sort of a follow-up. So I'm not going to go into the last principle so much, because we'll just kind of talk it out a little bit, but the idea here is that the major categories of our experience, at least in the world, seem to fall into like 4 different areas. One of them is consciousness and intentionality. Another is form, which accounts for dissimilarity that we see in the world. Another is substantive quality. It's also what accounts for the richness of experience or quality in the world. And then we have various external modalities of those being bundled in various asymmetrical patterns to give things their unique predictive capacity. So what does it mean then, in light of that, to have evidence, let's say, for God? Because evidence means to make evident to a mind by way of phenomenal experience, like rational inference or existential meaning. This is usually construed as anything presented in support of a proposition, or as some set of entailments that give us reason to take something to be true. Evidence as such must require that there be universal causal dependency relations between things, reason giving features of the world, such that sound inferences can be made between them. So my model, as I've just presented to you, we can kind of unpack a few things once I just finish the statement. It would predict that there are 2 types of causal dependency relations. And thus 2 fundamental ways to derive evidence. One would be evidence for inference type. It would be evidence of inference type. Evidence of something is an inference based on ontological unification. These are explanations that come in terms of more simple states that have broader explanatory power and don't exclude theories, but they unify theories. In other words, this method explains a broader range of phenomena by appealing to fewer, more general, or increasingly more simple and more general entities. It is a conceptual move from some set of phenomenal particularity towards universality. I guess a good example of this is like electromagnetism and the weak interaction forces, how they appear very different at low energies. However, to explain like the mutual interactive compatibility between the two, the electro-weak force is posited as a unification principle, where you have one more simple higher order field that's posited to contain the collective explanatory potential of both, so that anything that appears in this field, you'd have an explanation as to how it would wind down. But you only have, let's say, linear or scientific explanations when you have the dissimilarity already embedded in the features of the world, and then you can describe how it will evolve after that. So that's evidence of. Evidence of is more hierarchical, moving back to a more simple but broader and all-encompassing state. And then evidence for inference type is something. So evidence for is something is pretty much the standard scientific inference based on theoretical predictive capacity. So these explanations that predict a specific outcome based on prior heuristics or verified predictions, or they provide a basis for navigating uniformity and regularity found between phenomena with sort of like practical utility, rather than trying to integrate and unify and create sort of a theory of everything, let's just say. This is the conceptual move from some sort of antecedent particularities to some distinct set of particularities that causally follow. So it's from particular to particular. And in virtue of having a particular, because of the nature of particularization is what gives things their predictive capacity, you now have, let's say, experience or prior heuristics to base your probabilities and or predictive theories on. So, for example, if I hypothesize that the more salt I add to water at higher boiling temperatures, let's say I think if I hypothesize that the more salt I add to water at higher temperature, the higher boiling point the temperature becomes for that water. That could be like a scientific prediction or something like that. So I have a specific like prediction that can be confirmed or falsified. If testing my hypothesis against normalizing controls confirm the truth of my hypothesis, then you can kind of consider that my hypothesis confirmed and reliable for constraining, let's say, future hypotheses that would kind of compound like that. So both inference types are taken seriously in both the philosophical literature as well as the scientific literature. Additionally, both are needed because no isolated hypothesis can make predictions alone, since they require prior auxiliary assumptions for predictability to be possible, sort of like the do-him-crime thesis. And every independent assumption needs ontological constraints to have identity in principle, such that in virtue of its identity, it can causally influence the state of affairs that being predicted. It can causally influence the state of affairs being predicted to follow from it uniquely over and above, let's say, a competing hypothesis. So I guess a good example is what it means for P to be evidence of E is that P fits within the scope of reduction or transcendental reduction of E. P is only possible given E and would be impossible without E. So it's more of strict possibility rather than probability. This basically means that P fosters a set of reductive expectations to account for its dependence on E. If we have P, like phenomenal P, it would necessitate E. So falsifiability is not required. It's not probabilistic. It's not predictive, because moving from more simple states to more complicated states is principally unpredictable, because you can arbitrarily choose from the hierarchy of properties and then rebundle them. And alternatively, under the evidence for inference type, let's say you have phenomena P, you would be described more so as, what it means for E to be evidence for P is that E raises the probability of P. So sort of an empirical deduction. P is more likely given E than it would be without E, like all things being equal. This means that E fosters a set of predictive expectations to account for P's dependence on E. If we have an E, we expect a certain outcome. So this requires falsifiability. This is probabilistic. This is the basis of prediction. And it's really what's constitutive of naturalism. Naturalism is sort of a response to the metanatural. The metanatural is the imposing of dissimilarity, and naturalism is the dissolving of that dissimilarity, which is why I guess the scientific enterprise, the most universal generalization as the study of the natural world is sort of like entropy. And once entropy does its thing, then there's no scientific account for how do we get back, or how do we cycle back in some sense, without presupposing a counter principle to that. So, evidence of would describe the instantiation of information structures, code, universal, which is the particularization of universals and the bundling of properties. And evidence for would describe cycles of uniformity on the already rendered qualitative states. It's more empirical, it's more sensible in that sense. Repeated patterns of regularity in the world. So what theism is targeting is evidence of. So the base, or let's say the root of evidence of, or explanations of, using that same sort of rhetoric, would be what we call God, or what I call God. And evidence for, with its inherent incompleteness, because it needs to be incomplete, because if it was all-encompassing, it wouldn't have any explanatory power. It needs to be limited, it needs to be incomplete, it needs to be constrained in order to make unique predictions about future state of affairs. And that's the difference there. So we have those four categories. We have consciousness, we have form, we have substantive quality, which correspond to what most, I guess, major religions, at least in the Neoplatonist tradition, would call the triune base at the fundamental state of reality, something that can generate and actualize potentials, something that can sustain potentials in their state of regularity, and then something that dissolves potentials. So you have like the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. You have the Christians, more vague but still comparable mode of the Father, Son, and Spirit. You have Neoplatonism, obviously. You have the One. You have Nous, and you have the World Soul, all corresponding to that same thing. And that's sort of my conception of theism. There's more to say, and perhaps we could talk about that. And that was a lot of information. I completely understand this. It might be a little bit overwhelming, but maybe if there's anything that stood out to you, Tom, you can kind of pick a few things out, and then maybe we can just like unpack them a little bit. And I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Sure. What was that thing you said about the ontological categories always having a polar opposite, or something like that?
Yeah. So it's sort of like both.
No, restate what you said. Restate what you said.
I think that was the second principle. So it's the principle of ontological symmetry, where sorry.
Yeah, probably. Go ahead. What is it? Tell me what it is. Reread it.
Yeah. So it's that all features, let's say, like a symmetrical duality of active and passive opposites are constitutive of all phenomena.
Okay. What's the opposite of potato?
Sorry?
What is the opposite of potato?
Well, potatoes already is a bundle of active and passive. It's already a conjunction, so it's already a separate independent entity.
It's okay. You said every phenomenon has its opposite. So that is a phenomenon. Potatoes exist. They are a phenomenon, which means they must have an opposite given your definition. What is the opposite of potato?
Wait. The composition itself, remember, this is not a...
No, you said phenomenon.
It's a non-linear...
Sorry? You said phenomenon. Any phenomenon, potatoes existing as a phenomenon. So given your definition, there has to be an opposite of potato. What is the opposite of potato?
Well, it would be the antimatter of a potato.
The antimatter of a potato. There's no such thing.
There is. There's symmetries in physics all throughout physics. So if you want to drill down to the base of physics for any, let's say, contingent object, there's a symmetrical principle that will account for the properties of whatever you want to point out to. So it's a potato, or
what's the opposite of a gluon?
What's the opposite of a gluon?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a physicist, but
what's the opposite of a tachyon?
I'm not a physicist. This is...
Yeah, they don't have opposites. This is a trick question. Not everything has opposites.
That's what it's...
What's the opposite of gravity? What's the opposite of gravity?
Anti-gravity.
There's no such thing as anti-gravity. So physics does not have opposites to everything.
So you don't think symmetries sit at the root of physics? Is that what you're saying?
No, symmetry are a useful thing which can be used to make inferences about physics.
Symmetries are the basis for constraining all conservation principles.
Yeah, symmetries are a mathematical analysis to make inferences about things. It's not at the core of physics. It's not
but a mathematical. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So no, there are not symmetries for everything. That is false. So your second law is wrong, just objectively wrong.
It's not because here's another way to. No.
What's the opposite of potato?
I just told you that a potato is a bundle of properties, and each of the elements that compose a potato have a physical negative feature, a negative and positive feature. Yes, they do. But that's the side point. I can give you clarification on what the relevance there is.
So again, not everything in physics has a symmetry. Lots of things. It's very useful.
Look,
not everything in physics.
False. Look, everything in physics has a symmetry, but has a governing symmetry. And because remember, this is the principle of
we can already prove that false in like 5 seconds. Not everything in physics has a symmetry.
Well, the thing is, you can say, oh, the number one doesn't have it. What's the symmetry of the number one? Like, you know what I mean? What's the symmetry of a strawberry? But what I'm saying is, remember, there's a difference between the ontological governing principle, right? That conserves the features.
There is no such thing as an ontological principle. Those are contradictory terms. Principles are abstract. Ontological is what exists.
No.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
No, I'm sorry, but no.
Well, the thing is, I mean, that's just a difference. That's just a difference in use of language. So you might be saying something like, when I say principle in what I just read out, I'm referring to, let's say, descriptions, again, which correspond to reality universally. So, all you have to do is ask for clarity, and I can give it to you. But that's basically the idea.
But what you said is just wrong. So again, you've made up.
It's not just wrong. It's not just wrong because you're not really addressing anything at all. You're just
So I'm going to say it's wrong, and then I'm going to explain why it's wrong. I'm not just going to say it's wrong. Okay, so you got to stop and don't jump in and just listen for a minute. So you've made up a bunch of terms.
Tom, forgive me, Tom. Forgive me. I hate interrupting. There were just a couple of people in the audience that were asking, like, I don't want to miss the forest for the trees. And what they're saying is, some people are saying, like, they're kind of, we could give a few sentences that show the big picture in terms of how this.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting into.
You bet.
So what you've done is you've made up a whole bunch of terms, and you're saying these terms apply to describe things that exist in reality, but you have nothing to support any of that. It's like, the phlogiston. You know what phlogiston is? The theory that heat was like an original. There was a particle when you burn things that was released in heat, and this particle is what caused the thing to float or to go up. This is all made up. It's just you look at things in reality, you apply definitions to it, and you say these things exist. That's all you've done. You've taken all these definitions.
That's really not what I've done. But go continue.
It is. No, it is.
It's not. It's not. But go ahead.
In fact, I can prove it. Stop. So I can prove it. It's pretty simple.
Okay.
Demonstrate your definition of parsimony is correct.
What, you mean the idea of simplicity, where there's less parts, where there's less multiplicity, and there's less distinctions? Yep. What about that doesn't sound like simplicity to you?
Because it's a made-up definition for human usefulness. It doesn't correspond to reality. There's no simplicity law. There's no part of the universe.
When you use language, there's something in common with language and with reality itself. Otherwise, you couldn't say, wait. Otherwise, you couldn't say, no, you couldn't say that one proposition is more accurate than the other. Accuracy is a proposition of, accuracy is a feature of correlation, which is why truth, even though it's a feature of propositions, there's still something that the proposition is corresponding to, such that it can be said to be more or less accurate. So you can't just say, oh yeah, it's a description, or it's just like a floating concept, therefore it has no ontological status. I mean, the same time, it's still
No,
something that
it's
reality
false.
and principle has
Saying
the
it's false.
capacity
It does not correspond to reality. So you're saying you have this property, and you're saying this property corresponds with reality. I'm saying you have made this property up. You have no evidence that it supports reality, or that it corresponds to reality. So you have no evidence it's true. You
So
just
what
made
property are you talking about now? Are you talking about parsimony?
every single one. Let's just go with parsimony. Yes.
Okay. So
Made up.
you don't think there's an ontological correspondence to what it means to be simple?
Correct. There is no ontological
Wait.
correspondence to anything there. Simplicity is a description of what's useful to humans to explain things. It has nothing to do with existence. There's no ontology to simplicity. It's purely epistemic. It's purely what we describe things as. There's no like essence of simplicity. It's not like different things that exist. Some has more simple than other. No, simplicity is a property of explanations and sentences. It doesn't actually.
Look, simplicity. There's two ways to think about it, though. So you can think about it. Yes, there is. There's simplicity in with regards to your explanation, right? So you can say, from given my background information, I have a more simple pathway to explaining something. But ontological simplicity is a real thing. This is why we have unification theories in physics and in
One
philosophy.
second. If
Google
we can
the
just
paper.
hold on
Find
one
me
second.
ontological simplicity.
If we can just let Nomad finish that point, and then I promise Tom we'll come right back to you. Is that Nomad?
Yeah, I mean, it seems completely bizarre to me for someone to say that there's no such thing as ontological simplicity, like as if to say that something can't be more simple in an ontological sense than another thing. Like something can't have more parts than another thing. That seems completely absurd to me. But
no. So ontological simplicity is if you posit two theories, whichever theory has the least part is the most simple. But there isn't
that's not what the principle was talking about. So you completely misunderstood that.
I know. That's the point. You're using made up terms that don't exist.
No, I'm not. I'm actually. If you listen to what the principle is, you wouldn't be strawmanning it with something completely distinct. And just because you haven't heard the term before, it doesn't follow that it's not something real. Like, come on.
How they use them. So I'm using the terms in philosophy how they use them. You may be using the same terms to mean something different. I have the definition right here. I just read it to you from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Ontological simplicity or parsimony measures the number of kinds of entities postulated in a theory. It does not measure the kind of simplicity of the things existing.
There's parsimony as in epistemic parsimony, and there's ontological parsimony, right?
No,
this principle that I put forward, is proprietary to me, yes, but that doesn't mean it has no correspondence. I'll read it again, or I'll say it again. It's the principle of ontological parsimony. It's unique to me. It basically says that unity, simplicity, and singularity are ontologically prior to diversity and multiplicity.
So going back to what I said like 5 seconds ago. Wait. So what I said was you made up a new term. So you just admitted
it's not a new term. It's a principle with perhaps novel meaning, but none of these terms are new. Parsimony is not new. Ontological is not new.
Right. The terms mean things in philosophy, and you're using them to mean something else, which means you've made up a new term, or you've made up a new meaning for the existing term. Like you've made up your own language, which is okay. You can do that. That's totally fine.
Okay.
But nothing you say corresponds to the definitions as they are used in philosophy. So there's a problem here. Everything you said in your introduction is like if I just gave an introduction in French.
Here's the thing. See, like everything that I said, okay, I'm kind of getting a little bit of a hasty generalization kind of feel from you, because rather than sort of digging in deeper and addressing, like, let's say, particulars of an idea that I'm putting forward, regardless of what I name the idea, it seems like you're just stepping back and saying everything you're saying has no basis in philosophy, and everything you're saying is just something that you've made up and has no correspondence to reality. That doesn't address anything I've said. For all you know, it could be something novel, and I can detail things out, and then we can kind of work through it together. So again, all I'm saying with this, with the idea of parsimony, call it whatever you want, put your name on it, put some other name on it. All I'm saying is that the more fundamental something is, the simpler it will be, let's say, more unified and more singular it will be, and the broader in its scope of explanatory potential. That's what a unification theory does. It uses lesser, it moves up a hierarchy of generalization, which is different from linear causality. Linear causality is what the scientific enterprise is involved in. That's the distinction I'm making. I'm making a hierarchical distinction. I'm making a distinction
First
between.
thing I said already disproved this. So the whole point I was saying is that you can't have an ontological principle because principles don't exist. Principles are descriptions of what exists. So if you have an ontological simplicity,
principles, the truth maker of a principle is the ontology. If there was no yes, it is. When you have a proposition, it is true or false in virtue of corresponding to something that has been actualized. That thing that has been actualized is an ontological thing. So just by saying that it's a principle, but it has no correspondence in reality, that makes no sense, because all you're admitting is that propositions don't mean anything. Therefore, everything you're saying right now, I can just ignore.
Stop. So again, so if I said there is something, there's like the essence of tallness. Like if I said tallness was a thing that existed in the world, and there are different things that exist that have different like scales of tallness. Tallness isn't a real thing. It's a made-up adjective that we use to describe things. It doesn't actually exist in the universe. Matter exists, energy exists, gravity exists. Tallness doesn't exist. It's just a made-up adjective. What you've done is you've taken the adjective of simplicity and you said it exists, like matter and energy and gravity, but it's like tallness. It doesn't exist. It's an adjective we use to describe things.
Well, actually, tallness is a relational property.
Correct, and so is simplicity. That's just an adjective.
Yeah, but relational proprities exist.
That's what they do.
Relational properties can be embodied. Yes, they can. So, for example, if I have
tallness. Find me go give me a box, discover the essence of tallness. Find me
but here's the thing. If tallness is a transcendental, why would you be asking for a box? Because it's a descriptive, relational, conceptual real thing. It's not like concepts are something that are outside of reality.
Conceptual real thing. No. So again, it is a made up property of human minds to describe existing things. Things exist, yes. And there's differences between those things, yes. We call them certain things, and those are adjectives. And those adjectives are like tall and simplicity and fat and short. None of those things exist. Those are just things we use to describe stuff, like trees. The word tree doesn't exist. You're not going to find the word tree hiding under a rock somewhere, just like we're not going to find
the word tree. The word tree is let's say, a feature of a proposition. Let's say a noun. There's certain things within the nature of propositions that act as labels for bundles of properties, which means they're representational. So what you seem to be saying is that there's no such thing as representation in reality. And
representation does not exist in reality.
No, because representation does exist in reality. That's why we can talk to things through a medium of things. We can use words to communicate ideas about real things. We can use sign language. We can use sounds to communicate ideas about real things. That's what representation is. It's representing something through something else.
Yes, the representations are not existing things in reality.
But that just depends on what you construe existing to mean. If you say that existing things only have to be qualitative objects in the world, then you're already demarcating outside of. It's not like, here's the thing. It's not like conceptual things are not something that reality has the capacity to bring about in principle anyway. All you're doing is saying that, okay, well, this part of reality doesn't manifest in my purview as some qualitative object in the world. Therefore, because I'm committed to the scientific enterprise, I'm going to demarcate it. That doesn't make sense.
Nothing you said. So nothing you said represents my position. So, do leprechauns exist?
As potential, yeah.
Leprechauns exist.
As potential, yeah.
Okay, you have a ridiculous epistemology that has no basis in reality. Okay.
Wonderful. Well, the thing is, if something
do square circles exist?
Well, potentials are just things that are coherent, that are candidates for being actual.
So leprechauns exist in the world right now.
Wait, are you talking about as potential? Yes. They're not externalized potential. They're not qualitative objects in the world, presumably.
Looking for a yes or no here. Do leprechauns exist in the world right now?
Why would I concede to be forced or buttressed into your false dichotomy. I already told you what my answer is. It's as potential, yes, because as I said before, I reject the idea of hard emergence. So if something can possibly be that's coherent, then it is as potential prior to it being externalized as a qualitative object, which is why we can think about these things and conceptualize about their properties before they have, let's say, manifested in qualitative expression. If you reject the idea that potential exists, then you essentially hold a position where there's some type of ex nihilo creation, where things come from from nothing entirely.
No, no one holds that position.
Okay, so if there's no potential for leprechauns to exist, right? Or if there's no potentially existing leprechaun or leprechauns that exist as potential, then do you reject that idea?
Yeah, your idea is complete bullshit. It has no basis in reality.
So you reject the idea that leprechauns can exist as potential?
No, I reject your entire everything you just said. It's just all bullshit.
No, do you reject the idea that leprechauns exist as potential?
Yes, there's no such thing as potential.
So there's no such thing as potential. So therefore, anything that is actual comes from literally nothing.
No, like, what are you even talking about? Nothing you said even makes sense there. Like,
okay, so maybe repeat back to me what I just said, and I can kind of give some clarification.
You said something like that. If I believe there is no such thing as potential, then everything comes from ex nihilo creation.
Yeah. So what?
No, that's dumbass shit. That is completely false. I can believe everything exists potential because it's actual. Everything's actual, and it's always been actual, and it's existed indefinitely. There's no ex nihilo creation in that belief. So what you just said is
listen. If everything is actual, there's no possibility of change because there's nothing that there's no mode from which one perspective can move to another where there is dissimilarity or distinction. There's no thread.
That's already
you essentially have collapse. You essentially have
again. Stop. Mm-hmm. B theory of time already proves that false. Done. That theory's gone.
Yeah, but B theory of time is a constrained scientific model, right? That
correct. And it just refutes everything you just said, and it is a possibility that the way the universe is. So what you just said is false. We have a physics theory that says all the things you just said is bullshit, and it has more basis than everything you just said.
Listen. I already told you what the constraints of
your bullshit constraints don't mean anything. They don't mean anything.
Well, they don't mean anything to you, but who cares what they mean to you? I mean, this is what we're supposed to be talking about. Is what's objective about the feature? What's objective about the discussion, which we're supposed to be drilling in. Referring to, we're saying that well, your ideas are completely bullshit is
correct. You
helpful or not clarifying. All you're doing is just you're assuming. I mean,
no. I'm asking for evidence here. So you've made up a bunch of definitions.
Evidence of what? Like evidence how? What do you?
So again, as I've said like 10 times now, you have made up definitions. You think these definitions correspond to reality.
This is a meta conversation. You're having a conversation about the conversation. Talk about a specific point that I brought up, and then we can unpack it together. You said evidence. Okay, let's talk about evidence. What do you want to talk about?
I've already done this.
Okay, talk. I gave a distinction between what evidence of was, namely a relationship between a hierarchy of generalizations, namely
and all that bullshit. So all that, you're going to stop right there.
Of course it is to you because it doesn't coincide with your pre.
No. Again, so we got to go back.
Okay.
All of the terms you use, simplicity, ontological existence, potentiality, actuality, all of those are made up terms like leprechauns and unicorns and fairies, or I don't know, like trees. The word tree, just the word tree, not trees themselves, or the word leprechaun. All of these are made up words that do not correspond to things that exist in reality. Like if you want to use your silly definitions, that would be actuality, not potentiality, the actual world. None of those things.
Look, if everything is actual, then everything is actual in all possible modes and states of time, which means there's no distinction in the world. Yes, it does. It does. Because listen, you're bundling in, you're smuggling in something that your conceptual framework doesn't have the resources to even bring to the table. That's what I'm saying.
What are you talking about? What am I smuggling in?
So, for example, you're saying that everything exists as everything, and which requires there to be no distinction between.
No.
So, listen, wait. Which first requires there to be what you're saying is there's no potential. So there's nothing that moves into being and then out of being, right? That's essentially what that follows from your commitment. And then you're also saying that, what was that? Sorry?
No, like nothing you said corresponds to my position at all.
Okay, go ahead, clarify. I apologize. Let's run it back. Let's hear what your idea of.
You said there's something that my worldview entails that it can't explain. Like, what? There's nothing there. What?
No. Go back to your view on the relationship between potential and actuality. You said there's no such thing as potential and everything is actual. Everything is actual. So all possible. Stop. Yeah.
Both terminologies, potential and actual, that distinction is bullshit. It does not exist. It's like the distinction between waffle or it's just made up.
No, that's not true. That's not true. And I can show you why. Because even in, especially quantum theory, there are whole hosts or whole aspects of a theory that require things that are in Hilbert space that are purely just potential and are not actualized. So I don't even know what you're talking about. I mean, like, to say that there's no potential is completely bizarre to me. What do you mean when you say there's no potential and everything is actual? In fact, take away the potential part for the time being. What do you mean to say that everything is actual? Do you think that there's an infinite?
There's not everything is actual. Your terminology is nuts. It doesn't correspond to reality. So if I see a dog and the dog is furry and I pet it and say it's fuzzy, that does not mean fuzziness exists. Fuzziness is not a thing. It's not real. It's just an adjective that we use to describe things.
So you don't think qualitative properties are real things?
Again, so the same thing applies to potentiality and actuality.
Wait, no. You said fuzziness, right? So fuzziness seems to be like something like a family resemblance concept. It's like it's a label that we put on. It's not imaginary because if it wasn't.
Stop. This applies to all adjectives. It's just every adjective ever. So I can use adjectives like fuzzy to describe things that exist.
Yeah. So what are you describing that exists? What corresponds to the adjective? If there's nothing that exists, what's corresponding to the adjective such that you are accurate you are more or less accurate when you use the adjective? Do you think you could be more or less accurate when you use adjectives?
No, you'd be more or less accurate to use nouns. So you'd say like scientific.
No, nouns are just labels. Nouns are tags that you put on bundles of properties. They don't necessarily have to correspond to anything in particular, which is why there's different languages, because you can use a different word to associate to a different thing. Okay, so what I'm asking is are there truth makers? Are there truth makers to what? No, what I'm saying is, are there truth makers to adjectives? So there's no such thing as truth makers to adjectives. So when you use terms and sentences, there's nothing in reality to which they correspond.
No, you're just making up terms that don't exist in the field.
So adjectives don't exist.
Go with the philosophy.
Adjectives and what they correspond to don't exist. There's no phenomenological basis.
Language. Stop. So again, fuzziness does not exist. There is no essence of fuzziness in the universe. You're not going to find a fuzziness law or a fuzziness.
I don't even know what you mean by that, honestly. Like, go back to what?
It's pretty simple.
Are you saying like fuzziness as in fuzziness?
Doesn't exist. It's not a real thing in the world. Particles are real things that exist in the world. Fuzziness is not a real thing. Tallness is not a real thing. We use those adjectives to describe things. You have made up a bunch of adjectives. You are using them to describe things.
Relations are real things in the world. Believe it or not, relations are real things in the world. When you have two properties, they exemplify a particular type of relation to one another. If, let's say, within local proximity and given given they have a certain set of constraints, they will have particular relations. They will have a certain type of relations that you can describe. But that description of the relation can be. Do you think descriptions of relations can be true or false? Do you think descriptions of relations can be true or false? Because this is really telling here, actually.
Stop. Again, I just disproved everything you said.
No, you didn't. Do you think descriptions of relations can be true or false, accurate or less accurate? Answer the question.
Your question is incoherent.
No. Do you think?
Your question is. So
you don't think propositions we make about the world can be more or less accurate? Why are you even doing philosophy? What are you even talking about with any of you saying?
You haven't represented my position at all. You're just making up nonsense. Like,
No, I'm asking you a question. Do you or do you not think that propositions you make about the world can be said to be more or less accurate?
True. There's accurate.
Okay, okay, okay. So
Okay,
when
one
someone's
sec. Forgive me, guys. I hate to jump in. Sorry, I'm not trying to. I will definitely let you finish this point up, but then
Yeah.
hopefully we can move to again. I think some people in the audience are wondering if we could take a back step and just explain the chain of reasoning to where how this ties to God's existence or not. And Nomad, sorry for cutting you off.
Yeah, no worries.
I'll let you finish up that point, and then hopefully after that, Tom, forgive me. I know you'll have a round in the chamber ready to fire back as an argument, but I just want to hopefully from there maybe one of you guys or both can explain the chain of reasoning from this abstract argument to theism or atheism. So go ahead, Nomad. Thank you.
Okay, so the idea basically is that theism is a unification theory. Unification theories, what they do is, in principle, they don't exclude. They include all modes, but they don't include, they include all, let's say, metaphysical hypotheses, but they don't include them in such a way that they don't include them in a conjunction type way. A unification theory is more of an assimilation. What I mean by that is, for example, I can have like a brick, you know what I mean, and I can have another brick, and this little set of bricks can create a composition. Or a better example is like I can have two colors. I can have the color blue and I can have the color red. And a conjunction would be like having those two, let's say, in some shape side by side. But a unification would be something like having them assimilate into like the color purple, which in this example, perhaps not in reality, but in this example, it would represent analogously how they would unify, where the properties of both are preserved, but in a novel feature. What I'm saying, broadly speaking, with regards to theism, is that there are four major categories of our experience, namely consciousness, form that accounts for dissimilarity in the world, qualitative experience, and that's constitutive universally of what God is. God is a conscious agent that can actualize potential in the world and dissolve potential in the world. That's part of potency. So it can create modal objects in various degrees of multiplicity and then dissolve them. And what's happening is God is not using some external or some foreign object to mold. These features are constitutive of God's ontology, which is why, again, several religious traditions have this sort of tripart view of God. They have like this, the unifier, or the unified state, or that oneness. They have the dissimilarity instantiator, and then they have that which renders things into qualitative expression and gives things their existential, or let's say their value. And there's that's sort of the argument in a nutshell, namely that if you try to exclude consciousness from the fundamental state of reality, you don't have a unification theory. Because you haven't unified all categories of phenomena. You've arbitrarily demarcated it. So therefore you don't have a fundamental theory. You have lopsided scientific inference about what you think the fundamental reality is like. That's the point.
You bet. Thank you very much. And with that, let's see. What do we got for time? I think we've gone roughly, has it been roughly an hour?
Did you want me to explain like how this is relevant to God, the God argument?
Yes, we will definitely give you a chance to do that. And I will let everybody know we will go into Q&A fairly shortly. So thanks for that. And Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's this wiggly boogly principle, and this wiggly boogly principle proves the wiggly boogly principle, and the wiggly boogly principle is only explainable by the spaghetti monster. And if you don't have spaghetti as the fundamental property, well, then you're not explaining everything, because spaghetti is entailed in the fundamental nature of the universe because of the wiggly boogly principle. That's essentially everything he said. Made up words with made up properties that don't correspond to anything in reality. Philosophers are not allowed to do this because it would for anything. It's called the principle of explosion. From falsehood, anything follows. Everything he said is just made up properties that don't correspond to anything. There's no evidence of any of these. It's just nonsense. And so he's using this nonsense to try and say, therefore God exists. But you can just make up other kinds of nonsense to indicate, therefore the spaghetti monster exists.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Your statement. Well, I mean, I'll ignore like the whole first half of that because it was just like nonsense mockery. But you did bring up something that was partially valid, where you said that you seem to imply that there's like competing hypotheses to what I presented, like a spaghetti monster or some like oogity boogity. I don't know what you were talking about, but whatever. Well, again, what I put forward was not a scientific theory. It's a metaphysical inference, and metaphysical inferences are built upon unification theories. So they assimilate distinct categories of being that have explanatory features, and they integrate them in symmetries. That's what a unification theory does. So if reality is one, right, and we're looking to pose a unification theory or posit a unification theory, then whatever is fundamental can't have any alternate hypothesis. Whatever is fundamental is the most unified thing. There can't be two most unified things in one reality and still call it a unification theory, because unification means to draw back to oneness. That's the whole point. So everything you said there really didn't apply to what I was putting forward, and which leads me to believe that you probably weren't even listening. But that's the idea. The God thesis is a unification theory. Empirical science thesis are formulated in virtue of having phenomena with particularized constraints such that you can make predictions about them into the future. But they will always be incomplete because constraints require limitation. Limitation requires some type of halting principle, and those halting principles give phenomenon unique, let's say, predictive capacity. If things weren't halted or limited, they wouldn't have predictive capacity because they would be more general. And the more general something is, the less predictive capacity it has because there's more that it encompasses within this explanatory scope. So limitation gives things its particularity. Particularity gives things its explanatory potential or explanatory features. And in virtue of having bundled particulars, you can make inferences based on how those particulars have acted in the past about things in the future. But unification theories don't act like that. Again, that's the whole point.
Again, that's the whole point. The Woogly Boogly principle does the Hoogly Boogly principle, which is required by the spaghetti monster, and the spaghetti monster can only explain it. There's only one possible explanation. If it doesn't have spaghetti, well, it can't have no power. It's the same thing.
So we
Just
will.
a bunch of nonsense.
All right. Well, if you say so.
We'll move into the Q&A. So if you have a question out there, please fire that question in the live chat. We will pull it out, put it in our list, and read it off. We also have super chats. If you'd like to, don't know if I mentioned, I always forget this. If you'd like to make a super chat, it gives you the chance to make a comment toward one of the speakers of which they would get to respond to. And all super chats, whether they be question or comment, go to the top of the list that we're reading. So with that, Genius Tracks, thanks so much for your super chat. Genius Track said, TJump and James are a far better potential duo than Steve McRae and Kyle Curtis. Start a series, fellas. You basically already have. That's really nice of Genius Tracks. I like Tom. You know what? I mean, he's a little rough around the edges. So we all know that. But we enjoy the debaters that we've gotten to have here. It's both Tom and Nomad, you guys have both been awesome. I appreciate you guys being here tonight. Seriously. So that's nice of you, Genius Tracks. We hope that hopefully Steve and Kyle, I mean this, I really hope they get, become friends again. They've both helped this channel a lot. I know that, I can't remember. Tom, do you get along well with Steve or not? You guys are friends, right?
No, not really.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. That's awkward. So, for those of you who don't know, it's the eternally burning feud, TJump and Steve McRae. So anyway, we appreciate, Steven Steen says, James double header? Hot. Okay. Well, thanks, Steven. That's pretty sick. We appreciate your support of the channel. Glad you're here. Next up, we've got a number of questions coming in. Thanks for your questions. The next one is Mind Onion. Thanks for your question. They had a question for Nomad. They said, "Can you explain your opening to me as if I were a 5-year-old, please?" And I think they mean it sincerely. I don't think they're trying to troll.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, these are not simple things to talk about, and there's a lot of that's something I definitely want to work on. I guess the best way to describe it is that there are sort of two axes to giving evidence for something. One leads to unity and or is the basis of unification theories or models. And then one is more linear. So one's hierarchical, one's hierarchical. One's a union of an array of phenomena by making generalizations between those phenomena that account for both the qualitative aspects and the distinctions, and building a hierarchy up in like a natural order. Okay, so here's an illustration that might be helpful. Imagine you have a number line and the numbers are in their natural order, namely they're in the sequence of their identity dependent relationships. So 1 and 1 makes 2, and 2 plus 1 makes 3, and that's that following sequence. That would be analogous to sort of the natural hierarchy, or a natural set of properties that exist, let's say, prior to instantiation. But instantiation, or actualizing something, would be something like taking 1 and taking 25 and taking 33 and taking -41 and bundling them in a composition, bundling in a sub-composition, externalizing them from that primary line, and that corresponding to, let's say, features of the world. Now, you can look at the features of the world. Let's say there's a variety of different compositions with different number variations. You can look at those features of the world and say, oh, well, look, there's these things in the world, and look how we're describing the world. Isn't that great? Or you can see how they interact, let's say, based on the properties they have. Or you can say, wow, look at the generalizations I can make between them. And if I put those generalizations in their natural orders, there's a number line that exhausts the scope of all possible, let's say, properties that can be instantiated. Now, what I've been saying is that number line in its simplest form comes down to 4 different things. It comes down to consciousness, comes down to form, or like when we can basically represent form as information. There is such thing as information, and it's what we record in the world. I don't know if Tom really believes in information either, and then there's qualities in the world. There's things that inform us in, let's say, in a qualitative way rather than a distinct, discrete way. So those are the 3 main categories, and those things can be disassembled and reassembled into a variety of different modal properties. But when they have been assembled into those properties, they have unique predictive capacity in virtue of the properties that they do in fact have, based on how they interact, based on how they could be. But ultimately, those interactions that they have are driven by the natural tendency to want to, you could call it entropy if you want, but undirected normative force is entropy, but that's basically to drive back to uniformity, and that's how we measure energy in certain things. But the instantiation of those properties in those things to begin with is exactly what I'm referring to. And those 4 principles are universally constitutive of what I call God, what is God, for most major religions as well. There's devotional aspects to it too. There's devotional things to consider broadly, but that's the idea.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Had a couple of super chats fire in. Tioga Art, thanks for your super chat. They asked, what is the atheist-theist position, so atheist/theist, position on climate change, climate catastrophes, and climate refugee situations? Theistic and atheistic views, please. So I think they are wanting to hear both of your opinions on climate change and climate catastrophes, as well as climate refugee situations.
Sure, why not? Climate change is one of the biggest problems the world faces today. There's going to be a lot of people who are refugees from it, and I don't know how we're going to help them all. It's really a big problem in the fact that a lot of people, especially in America, deny that it's even real, is going to cause a lot of problems for a lot of people and destroy a lot of lives.
I guess to follow up on that, I don't really know too much about climate change. I am broadly an advocate for a balanced and holistic environment. So that's managing waste appropriately to the best that we can. And I guess our most informed scientists today would say that climate change is happening. And I guess they mean by climate change is that the Earth is warming to such a degree that things are, well, it's going to cause certain areas to be uninhabitable. But I really don't know. But I think it's worth mitigating against detrimental effects that nature might have, given what we do know. So yeah, that's all I would say.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Next up, Sigifredo Sarabia. Good to see ya. They ask, Nomad. Forgive me, am I?
Nomad.
Nomad. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem.
He has what is? They asked, why doesn't the potential of quote of no God unquote not work?
Why does the potential of no God not work?
Yeah, I don't fully understand.
You said
I understand what he's saying. Yeah. So here's the thing with if theism is true, then it's a unification theory. Of course, that's what I'm positing. Then what is atheism? How can we even think in terms of the possibility of atheism in that sense? Well, what I'm saying is that atheism is an eliminativist position. So we have this faculty where we can experience the world directly, but then we have this ability to go into this mode of representation where we become intellectual and then we form propositions about things. But in so doing that, we create a new context where we can isolate our knowledge, or let's say we can isolate our beliefs from their ontological dependence. Like we can look at a chair and not know everything about how the chair's atoms all come together and coalesce all the way down to whatever they fizzle into. So we have this ability to almost abstract things representationally out of the world and then make propositions or form beliefs about them. That's exactly what I think atheism is. I think that it's abstracting, right, certain properties out of the world and eliminating certain ones representationally that would entail theism, which is why most atheists, for the most part, would say something like consciousness is not fundamental or something along those lines. Because as soon as you admit consciousness is fundamental, form and, qualities in that sense are fundamental, then you have that tripart structure that I've been talking about the whole time, which is what people mean by God. And of course, there's more entailments from that, including like the religious and spiritual devotional ones, but that's sort of like the basis.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Barry Switzer, thanks for your super chat. Barry asks, for Nomad, is there anything that is only conceptual, or does everything exist potentially?
So I think there is something, I think there are certain things that are only potential. And I think those are sort of like prime, or let's say more fundamental modes of information. But if you really think about it in an ontological sense, information is the ability, is distinction, it's dissimilarity, it's degrees and modes of dissimilarity. That's what form is. So in conceptual space, I think that there's a hierarchy of dependency relations in the same way that all numbers are dependent on the number one in some sense, even though they're not temporally related or dependent on the number one. There seems to be some type of ontological dependence where there's an identity relation between them, such that you can remove the identity from one and still have entailments that fall within that category, like 1 + 1 is 2. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to do 1 + 1 is 2 if they didn't share a common property, namely the number 1. And you can kind of see that relation in, like, if you said red and blue is 1, you immediately intuit a notion of category error. But we do things like that in like computer programming. Like we'll say like 1 = red, but it would be like a variable. So it would be like, that would be a mode of representation. It wouldn't be a mode of like sort of actualization or identity dependence, what I call it. So I think all conceptual objects in their singularness prior to being instantiated are universal. So when you think about the number 1 and I think about the number 1, we're not thinking about 2 different number 1s. We're just having 2 different perspectives on the same transcendental object. And the ontological correspondent to the number 1 is like, let's say, 1 degree of dissimilarity. And that can be embodied in various ways and then, let's say, reflected qualitatively in the world as having 1 bit of information or something like that. So things have varying degrees of dissimilarity, varying degrees of information content from their relation. You could do as relations or as descriptive properties, and then, you can kind of go from there.
You got it. Thank you very much. Next up, Sigifredo Sarabia, thanks for your question. They asked, what's spaghetti called if there is a spaghetti monster? Is that
Spaghetti.
is that the first time that Sigifredo Sarabia has trolled us? That was okay. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, man.
Logos Theos, thanks for your question. We'll try to squeeze through a few more. Sorry, folks. I'm trying to get through as fast as I can, and I'm sorry if we don't make it to yours. But Logos Theos, thanks for your question. They said, for Nomad, since your opponent didn't understand basic philosophical concepts and dismissed everything you said, what is your takeaway from this debate?
I think he understands basic philosophical concepts. I just don't think that he's thought through his entailments sufficiently enough. And I think that he's probably a little bit overconfident, and perhaps anything new that I've said as a result of this being a debate just ended up being a resort to like mockery and dismissiveness and blah, 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 and blah, 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 which I don't know. I don't know if you can call that an academic debate but overall, we all have our days, so no issues.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Sigifredo Sarabia, thanks for your next super chat. They said atheist, theist. I think they're saying, I think they want both of you to answer. Can something exist that has no form?
That's a good question. Do you want to go first on this one, Tom? I don't know what you think about form,
but form isn't a real property of things. It's just a made-up term used to describe abstract things like fuzzy. It doesn't actually exist.
I knew he was going to say that. He doesn't believe in information. I would disagree with that. So I actually think that anything that exists.
No. You said I don't believe in information. Don't make assumptions about my belief system. You know nothing about it. So.
Okay, so that's what form is. Form is information content. Information is what gives things their unique character.
No definition. Nothing in physics ever says that ever. So if you can find me a paper, great. But
but nothing in. It's weird because you go from this really bizarre overcommitment to physics, and then you're like nothing in philosophy either. Well, if I want to grab both of those and say there are things in philosophy that refer to things as form, and then there are things in physics that refer to things as information, and there's a correspondence between them both. Like, there's really no issue. But you seem to want to bounce back and forth. I don't know. It's bizarre.
Because you said my position. You said I don't believe in information. The kind of information I believe in is the physics kind of information.
Well, physics refers to Hilbert space information, which has no external actualized correspondence. So
that's false.
Yeah. Really? Yeah.
Information in physics can exist outside of Hilbert space. Information in physics can exist on lots of different things.
Yeah, but
matter. So no, what you said is false. The kind of information I believe in is the kind of information in physics, which you probably don't know much about.
Look, if
I do.
I know enough about physics, but I don't really want to talk too much about it anyway. But what I'm saying is that if you think that there's no form in, or let's say if you think information it only exists in matter, or like as matter, it's a weird, I don't know, it's a bizarre view anyway. But then let me ask you, in what sense, like, what's your account of how things change? Like, because change seems to be something where, let's say, form or pattern or information is embodied in some sense, but information is lost and information is gained as it interacts with its environment, or whatever that object is, and interacts with the environment. And then as such, you have what is perceived to be some type of successive chain of events, let's say. But you seem to be saying that it's only matter that has information. That's not even, I don't even think that's a commitment of physics, especially quantum physics. But
Physics, the definition of matter. In physics, it refers to the information of a physical system.
okay.
Yeah, it's physical information. Why it's called physical information in physics.
Yeah, that's just information that's already been embodied. But prior to being actualized, let's say embodied externally, you don't believe in that information. So you don't believe in quantum information or...
No. See, physics doesn't believe in any of that potential actuality stuff either. That's not a part of physics. That's a part of some theology that it doesn't, most philosophers don't even accept. So no, that part isn't physics.
You don't think physicists believe in potentiality and actuality?
Correct, they don't. That's a completely...
The commitment to B theory of time doesn't even is not that's not an entailment of the commitment to the B theory of time either. So I don't even know what you're talking about.
No one in physics grants potentiality and actuality. Those are purely just Thomistic philosophy.
It's not really Thomistic. It is Thomistic, but it's not only Thomistic. Perhaps, and I don't even think it stems from Thomistic. Like, I mean, these are in traditions. These are in Eastern traditions too. Like, it's bizarre to me that you would concede publicly that there's no such thing as possibility that's unembodied, or let's say prior to qualitative instantiation. It's just odd. Anyway, but
gotcha. We can jump to I think we have time maybe for one more question. Thanks for your generous use of your time tonight, guys. I know we've been here a while, and then we had that late start, and I'm sorry about that. So Sarah J, thanks for your question. And they asked Nomad, how does he, quote, draws back to this one? I think they mean like draws back, like in the like a chain of reasoning, like in this draws back to this. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. So maybe they're asking they could be asking how I reason back to this unified state, or how does one in an ontological sense draw back to this unified state? Okay, so the distinction there would be that how would I represent a causal chain of events that move back to the oneness in a general sense? And then the other question just sounds like what happens when I die? I mean, when we die physically in an ontological sense, we lose our particularity, at least in our body. But again, I think that we're composite beings such that we have compositional manifolds, so which account for both our consciousness, our intellects, our psyche, and then our physical state. So when our physical state dissolves, then there are prior states or prior compositional manifolds or patterns of being that can sustain, and that's just becoming more general. I think once we pass the soul, we already assimilate back into the unified state of God. But in some sense, when we become a soul, we're reaching back into that prior mind and pulling down transcendentals, and that's the act of conceptualizing about things. We're taking ideas and we mold them. And then when we like, oh, right, that's a great idea or something like that, then we seek to embody them in the world in some way. So.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. With that, Sigifredo Sarabia just fired in a super chat. Thanks so much. Sigifredo asks, Nomad, how is there free will if TJump argues that reason itself determines a decision and so deterministic? I think they mean like, and so it is deterministic.
Well, I don't know if TJump would concede that point that reason alone determines, because again, but anyway, but yeah, go ahead. Were you gonna say something?
Reasons, not reason.
Oh, reasons, as in like prior antecedent causal events or something like that. That give reason. Oh, okay. Well, I'm more of a compatibilist because I see that even in philosophy there are symmetrical principles all over the place. So we have formal logic, informal logic, and they just correspond to that duality that I talked about. We have soundness and validity, consistency and completeness. We have rationalism and empiricism. We have, even in our theories of justification, we have like this duality that seems to correspond to the formal, strict, distinct side of things. And then we have like the informal side that corresponds to our phenomenological sense perceptions. So even when it comes to free will, I think that duality is sustained. I think that there is a move from universal to particular, and that's what we call free. It's arbitrary. It's a singular entity arbitrarily instantiating properties. And arbitrary just means to abstract things out of their natural ordering, such that the things that you're abstracting don't entail a following condition in virtue of their identity. It's something that transcends the individual identity, which is why you can take numbers out of order, let's just say. And then determinism is just the inverse but proportional relationship to that. It's the push back to uniformity. And again, I think that's why the scientific enterprise has to hold onto determinism, because if you have determinism and then you add freedom on top of that, you completely eliminate the basis of predictability, because there's always something that you can say falls outside of the scope of predicted capacity, given that you have all the information necessary to predict the consequential events from pre-existing conditions. So I think that I hold more of a compatibilist view where there is genuine freedom and then there is genuine determinism. But I think freedom is the active principle that when it's active, it overrides the deterministic function. But when it's passive, the determinative function becomes dominant. And then that's what it means for things to operate in an undirected manner, if that makes any sense. So that's sort of my view.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I appreciate it. You guys have been very generous with your time. Means a lot. And with that, I want to say thanks for spending your time here, everybody. We are excited that tomorrow, the first time ever, gym majors will be debating Sky Out on whether Moses ever existed. So that will be a fun one. Then next week we have a defense of a Christian perspective of aliens. That's going to be a new one for sure. And then Monday we have Old Testament Bible prophecy being debated by a Christian and an atheist. And then I think, well, we got a lot more coming up. So we're excited about it. We appreciate you guys hanging out here with us. And with that, keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. And want to last mention our final time. Both Tom and Nomad have their links down in the description. We highly encourage you to check it out. And they are both friendly guys, as you can get a hold of them on Twitter. So with that, take care and keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable.